It's always a bit weird, you know, when you're a conference chair, you're the organizer, and you put yourself up as the first keynote speaker. Yeah, it's a bit odd, I have to admit that. And I know I've done the same thing actually before at another IMEC conference. Possibly I'm narcissistic, who knows? But I don't think that that's the main reason, because the main reason is actually that what I'll do is to give like an overview, like a framework, where other people will later zoom in more into more specific topics. So my lecture that I'm not going to give until 3 o'clock, I'll give a full overview of what do we know about the research on COVID-19 and beyond. And this will possibly, or it may work as a kind of a framework or the foundations for all the next sessions, which will elaborate some of those bits and pieces. So different people have been coping. Oh, we go much too quick here. I just wanted to stay with that slide. It seems that this slide doesn't want to be staying still there. That's intriguing. Ah, there we go. So different people cope in different ways with the current pandemic. So have a think for yourself. How have you been coping with the pandemic? Possibly you felt emotionally overwhelmed, or possibly you're one of the people who has been hoarding and who has been buying all the possible toilet paper. Or possibly you have been working very hard as a therapist or even as a researcher. When I talk for myself, the two coping styles that I've been using a lot is actually I've been starting immediately from the start. I've been organizing those meetings, Mental Health for All. And that's actually, we did like a small session of that earlier today. And I've also been doing a lot of research. And that was also my coping style to cope with this overwhelming situation of the pandemic. So what I did is that I had to look at all the different research that is out there in the field. And I've been trying to get a grip of that. So these are the studies that I've conducted. And these are all systematic literature reviews or meta-analysis. So I've looked at all the different studies that have already been studied on the psychological impact of COVID-19, SARS and MERS. And as you know, SARS and MERS were previous pandemics, which were also coronaviruses, just like COVID-19. I've also been looking at all the studies that have been examining how people perceive COVID-19. I've also been looking at the role of media and politics, and also on the role of capitalism, or in general, our economic system. How has that been influenced in COVID-19? And these are all systematic reviews. So I've been basing my conclusions usually on hundreds or even thousands of studies. To further validate my findings, I have been doing some more research. The first one is actually a survey, and you can still fill it in, and that is coronaresearch.com, where I look at the psychological and existential impact of COVID-19. And of course, we've also been looking at the experiences and the effectiveness of our Mental Health for All groups. So all of those studies gave a lot of information, and I tried to summarize that. The first place where I've done that is like in the afterword of my book, The Economics of Meaning in Life. And that's a book that we will launch later today in the break. And so in the afterword, I have already been summarizing and synthesizing a lot of the research. But also later this year, another book of mine will come out about the psychology of COVID-19. However, I've been trying to synthesize everything. But as you may understand, there's so much information out there, thousands of studies. And how can we really make sense of that? I often like to use metaphors or symbols. And people who were there last year at the IMEC conference, or people who have seen my lecture from that online, you may remember that last year I already mentioned this example. A couple of years ago, I was in Bella Coola in British Columbia, Canada. And I discovered a full area full of all those petroglyphs, those carvings in stones. And it appeared that these are thousands or 10,000 of years old. And what I found intriguing are that there was the similar pattern everywhere of 3 circles, a circle and a circle and a circle. And so I asked the First Nation Canadians what these represent, those circles. And this is what they answered. They said the inner circle represents the self. And the self is embedded in society. And society is embedded in the wider nature or the universe. Since that moment, since I was taught this, I thought this has been like a framework, a way to try to understand what's going on in the world. And I've been using this framework a lot. And I'll also do that in this presentation, because it helps us to make sense of what's going on with COVID-19. Because it's not only a matter of nature or of biology, like the outer ring. No, what's happening with COVID-19 is that it also involves the society and the self. And it's this intriguing interaction between the nature, the society, and the self. It's that interaction which makes it such a unique pandemic. And that is actually, I will now, in a very systematic way, talk about all my research findings from all of those papers. I will summarize all of that for the nature, society, and the self. So I'll start with nature. There has been a lot of research on the history of pandemics. And when you need to summarize it, usually they speak of 3 stages, and I've added the 4th one. Of course, the first stage, when we really think about the hunters and gatherers or the first Homo sapiens, of course, they were victim to pandemics, like where there was a virus or a bacteria, everyone will be affected by it, and there was not so much that people could do against it. But over time, people developed more medical expertise, and they were able to control some of the pandemics, like the plague. And you can see a picture here of the famous plague doctor. And there have been many pandemics over the years, but people have been able to control that more and more, thanks to the medical insights. However, researchers are saying that nowadays we are in a new stage, where a new type of pandemics is happening. And that is what I would summarize as diseases of disparity. And these are actually pandemics of illnesses that are related to actually usually poverty and socioeconomic inequality. So this is about the high levels of psychological stress. It's about alcohol misuse, the misuse of any opioids or any other drugs, and suicides. However, I will go one step further, and I will give it a more specific name, because I'm talking about corona capitalism. And this is actually where nature, society, and self, where that's all connected, and it's all kind of connected via capitalism. Well, there's a particular brand, a particular focus of capitalism, which I call corona capitalism. I'll explain that in a bit more. When we focus on nature, what are the economics causes of the current pandemic? A lot of researchers have been saying that it is our increased contact with wildlife and deforestation that has actually increased our contact with animals who may be bearing any infectious diseases which can carry it over between people and from animal to people. But also our human water storage on a large scale that has brought the Zika virus and the mosquitoes, for instance, to the United States or to Europe. But also industrial scale of animal farming has brought animals very close to human beings. And also with all the antibiotics has also an impact on human health. But also the increased wealth on the economic market has actually also created a demand in rare species. For instance, they say that the COVID-19 virus has started in some wet markets in Wuhan. But those wet markets are a relative recent invention because of the increased wealth, because the Chinese economy has been more opening up. And due to the increased wealth, there's an increased demand in rare species. So actually, in that sense, it's the wealth creation that has increased, that has actually created COVID-19. And of course, we are very much aware of how dense populations and the global travel, like the use of airplanes, how that has actually brought the virus everywhere on the globe. And so also my previous research, I'm actually saying, well, when we really look at all of this, what's actually behind it? It's our capitalist way of looking at Earth. It's our capitalist way of looking at nature, society, and self. And the capitalist way, we could describe it as a functionalistic, or an old term for that is a very mechanistic or technological focus. And a focus on materialistic and hedonistic growth. And that is almost the opposite of looking at the inherent meaning that nature, animals, and people have. So let's now zoom in on the more societal aspects of COVID-19. Of course, we can say a lot about this, and on media, social media, we can read a lot about it. So, of course, for instance, in the United States and the United Kingdom, there's been a lot of criticism for governments who have not been timely in locking down or in giving sufficient protective personal equipment. And also in the UK, for instance, the government has denied to buy more ventilators. So there's been a lot of criticism around that. But there's also been a very slow production of PPE and of ventilators due to monopolies. Because a lot of the ventilators and a lot of the tests, they're actually only like one company on Earth can make these. And that is why there is such a big shortage of the right equipment. Without those monopolies, this would not have happened. And so there's also a lack of sharing scientific expertise, or at least a delay, particularly by some of the pharmaceutical companies, because they try to be the first to launch a vaccine or the first to have a good test. And also researchers and health organizations such as the WHO, they depend on grants or donations from pharmaceutical companies and also some other people with some big money. And this may actually also be related to some of the selection of research that researchers are doing, or the selection of the data that they're presenting. And so we know that there's a public debate about some inconsistencies or inaccuracies about reporting of figures. And of course, it's difficult to really find out what are the right figures in this time of uncertainty, and there's so many different ways of report it. But it may be something to look at it in a critical way. And also we know, particularly in the United Kingdom, is that when you are a worker in the National Health Service, you're not allowed to speak with any journalists or anyone else about the pandemic, because you could actually get fired. So what we really see is, again, this kind of capitalist ideology, which seems to be further aggravating COVID-19. What it did then was actually to examine my hypothesis that in capitalist countries, there are actually more infections and more numbers of deaths due to COVID-19. And indeed, there are relatively strong or moderately strong correlations between 10 different operationalizations or characteristics of capitalism and the number of infections and deaths. So unfortunately, it seems that it's capitalism in itself that has a big contribution to the impact and how big COVID-19 has been developing. And COVID-19 also has a huge unequal impact on people, and we will hear about it more later today, like people with a low socioeconomic status, or Black people, or people with from an ethnic minority group. They're more likely to get infected and more likely to get a severe infection. Also because these individuals are more likely to work outdoors or at the front line, be in poor housing conditions, or have a lack of funds for medical care, or have a lot of stress due to unemployment or financial insecurity. So what we see is that COVID-19, we are not in it all together, as a lot of politicians are saying. Absolutely not, because certain groups are really affected much more than others. So then the question is, what's actually hiding behind the masks? What's going on? when we look at society. The philosopher Heidegger was already talking about, the medical look that we can have at the body. And he was saying, well, of course, that's only one particular way of looking at the body, or the medical look, the medical story is only one way of looking at a pandemic. There's also the way how we perceive or experience our own body. And there's also actually how to experience life in general. So what he was more or less saying is that the epidemic is more than just the medical side. And that's also what the psychoanalyst Lacan was saying, is that there's more than the reality of, for instance, the pandemic. There's also the symbols and the imagination. It's not saying that it's only symbols and imagination, no, but it's reality and symbols and imagination. People need to make sense of the situation. They need to give it meaning. And the meaning that is very unique during this pandemic is what I call corona capitalism. Let's now zoom in a bit more what the studies are saying about how do people actually perceive COVID-19. So I really like all those models and graphics, so you'll see a bit more of that from me now very soon. So what we know is, if you look at the bottom, is that in the general public, in most of the countries, 60 to 80% of the people have a more or less accurate perception of how likely it is that they would get COVID-19, or how severe it is, and what they can do to prevent it or to treat it. However, that perception is not necessarily predicted by the objective risks. When you really look at like the personal situation, that's not the direct predictor of the perception. So we need to look at some filters there in between, because people have their own way of interpreting the risks, and they end up with having their own interpretation. Of course, there are in the first place already some of the filters by the scientists, because scientists need to make very quick decisions in how to communicate about the pandemic. And it's a hard job, because this is not normal science. It is science with very uncertain data, where very quick, rash decisions need to be made. And people usually play for the safest option, like they focus on the worst case scenario, because that's the best to prevent. It's better that they have like a too big lockdown and preventing some bad thing from happening than from actually being too conservative and saying, well, we don't need to have a lockdown at all. And imagine that things would have gone much worse. So it's understandable that scientists can be kind of exaggerating certain risks. However, what scientists communicate to people is not directly affecting how people look at COVID-19, because it also depends on how much they trust scientists. Of course, it's not only scientists who are communicating, it's mainly governments who have been speaking about the risks and what people need to do. And also their framing of the information is often not neutral. A lot of research is showing how governments are deliberately using fear to actually create action in the population. Governments are also trying to have some external control, for instance, by some authoritarian measures, by saying that the police will give fines to people who are not following the rules of isolation or using masks. But governments are also doing a more tricky thing, and that is they stimulated kind of internal control, or what Foucault has called self-governmentality. So that means that people, citizens, individual citizens, they start to fear, feel guilty, have shame or stigma. And due to that, due to their psychological feelings, their emotions that have been triggered by the government, due to that, people start to control themselves. It's the fear and the guilt that will stop them from going outdoors. And that is why they start to put mouth masks on, etc. So it actually seems to be the psychological message, the psychological impact from the governmental communication that explains how people look at COVID-19 and how they deal with it. But also what we know is that the more conservative people are and the more people actually mistrust governments, the less accurate will the perception be, and the more will they ignore any of the governmental communication. Already this morning in the Mental Health for All group, we've been talking also about social media communication. And we know that from all the studies looking into this, approximately 140 studies, it's showing that only 50 to 90% of all posts on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media accounts, only 50 to 90% is accurate. And it's understandable because they need to make it sensational to sell the product. And it's actually that the social media communication has a much bigger impact on how people see COVID-19 and how people cope with it. It has a much bigger impact than what governments communicate or what scientists communicate. It's the media that mainly controls how people think and respond to the pandemic. And it's also this perception that is subsequently also impacting our emotions and our behavior. So what is the emotional impact of COVID-19 when you look in the general population? Until now, there have been 26 studies in over 100,000 people. And what we know is that 59% of the healthcare workers experience acute or post-traumatic stress. And 37% of them experience depression, distress, insomnia, or anxiety. Whereas 1/3 of the patients experience such symptoms and 29% of the general population. And these numbers are much more than when you compare that with SARS or MERS, when only 1/3 of the healthcare workers had such symptoms and 1/3 of the patients and 50% of the population. So what we see is that the current impact is almost twice as big. The impact on mental health is almost twice as big as during SARS and MERS. And it's also important to bear in mind that the average number of symptoms that people have in the population is between 5% and 15%. So this is really much, much more. Why is that? If my PowerPoint is allowing me, I would like to share that with you. But it seems that my PowerPoint is not allowing me to do so. Because it is currently frozen. But I will get back there. Because the main thing is, I hope that you can still see me. Because I'm currently totally freezing. No, sorry for that. So the main thing is what research has been showing is that people are experiencing those mental health problems mainly because of the political impact that it has. So particularly in health workers, because health workers, they really worry a lot about a lack of PPE. They worry about the organization of the healthcare system. They worry about all those issues. And due to that, they actually feel really stressed out. And of course, when you are all the time working with people who have the virus, of course, that will make them feel much more vulnerable and that will make them feel much more worried. So let's try it again. Yeah, there we go. So this is precisely what I was saying about how the healthcare workers are very worried about the lack of PPE, lack of support at work. And in the general population, it's also obviously when people are ill, when people are more vulnerable, are older, or when they need to work outside, they're more likely to experience more depression, more stress, more anxiety. But it's also the quarantine itself that has created a lot of stress. We know that people who are in self-isolation are twice as likely to experience post-traumatic stress, depression, insomnia. There will be 1/3 more people who will kill themselves, which means that this year there will be 300,000 extra people who will kill themselves, mainly due to the quarantine. And that's almost the same number of people who actually have died from COVID-19. And these people are only the extra people who will die from suicide. And then there's also the side effects of being less physically active, have less social connections, have more financial worries. and also that non-urgent surgeries have been postponed. And all these side effects have a big impact on our body, our stress. And that can actually also lead to a worse immune system functioning, which can actually make people more likely to get severe COVID-19. So the side effects of quarantine, of self-isolation, may actually be very big. And this is a thing that you usually do not hear in the media, but I think is a very clear evidence for this point. And of course, there's also a lot of existential stuff going on. But you know, I'm not even going to talk about this because there's so many amazing speakers that we have today who will be talking about this much more, about how we get confronted with life's givens, with our mortality, with lack of control, where our daily life illusions start to fall away. And we may respond by to that by trying to push it aside or turning our anger towards others or towards ourselves. But actually people could also use this as a moment of change, as a wake-up call, because existential urgency can stimulate people to change here and now. And also, this is the final thing that I really wanted to say, is how meaning in life also is very important for how people perceive the situation. Because when people find it difficult to cope with uncertainty, they're more likely to have a large emotional response or to have a black or white reasoning. Also, extrovert people and less conscientious people are less likely to use protective behavior. And people with strong pro-social values, empathy, they're more likely to use protective behavior. So I've been talking a lot. I know this may be an overload of information, and yeah, this is actually my summary. How the self, society, and nature are all related. And they are particularly connected with each other due to what I have called corona capitalism. And I think when we're at this conference, it's very important that we start to look at COVID-19 from all those different perspectives, from the self, from society, from nature, from biology, and not to isolate phenomena, because they are very much related. And I also think it's important to look at opportunities that we have for change. So I've been talking very much, and thank you very much for listening.